Hi guys, I'm Matthew, your VB tutor. Welcome back to this short series, episode 3, where I'm going to explain how to open our connection, close our connection, and execute some queries. So far we've got our class initialize, create database, create tables, checking a function if our table exists, and obviously our log message, which we've used in every other method. But now we've actually got to connect to our database, because we've got these tables. We can't exactly create a table if we can't connect to that database. So first, let's build out an open connection method. So we're going to have public sub open connection by val, and we're going to have database path. So we're going to pass in the path of the database, and then we're going to have an optional item, because this is going to be our password. If you don't provide a password when you first create the database, or if you pass a blank string as the password, then it's not going to actually require a password. So we're going to have db password as string equals nothing. So that's going to be our optional password there. So again, we'll just start with our error handling. And maybe in that as well, we'll just want to set the connection object to nothing, to make sure that nothing's accidentally left open somehow by a faulty connection. So the first thing we want to do when we're opening our connection is just check if the object is nothing. If it isn't nothing, then maybe our database is already open. So we'll just check. So if con, again, con is our connection object, which is public, private across the entire class. So if our con is nothing, so basically if it's not instantiated, if it hasn't been set to anything, then we're going to set the con equal to a create object, adodb dot connection. So this is going to be our connection object, and then we just want to check if the connection state is open. So if the con.state is ad state open. Now ad state open, this is a variable from the ADO connection. You can see if we put this into the immediate window with a question mark, that value is 1. So that's just checking essentially if the state is 1, then we're going to exit the sub because the connection's already open. We don't need to open it. Now, from here, we need to create a connection string. Add a string. This string is going to be, again, these are very specific kinds of strings. If you do need help with these strings, I can put the string down in the description below. So the provider is Microsoft. Hopefully I can spell that right. Microsoft. ACE OLEDB 12.0. Our data source is going to be equal to our database path. And we're just going to close that off. Now, what if we have a password? So if the password is not equal nothing, so basically if the password is something, then we're going to append the constring, and we're appending the information required to actually assign that password to the database. So OLEDB database password equals database password. Close that off. So that's going to be our entire string, and then all we need to do is try and open that connection string. If that opened, then the code is going to continue, so we can assume that there's a successful connection. If not, it will jump down to the error handler and it will be handled down here. So we're going to log the successful connection, I'm just going to log message connection opened to database path, and log message connected with string. Just like to pass as much information to the log as we possibly can. Okay, so we've opened our connection. We've got our open connection object there. Now, once we've finished working with the object, we're going to need to close it as well. So we're going to create a close connection routine. So we've got public sub close connection. Again, error handling. Okay, that's error handling done. So now this one's going to be quite a simple one. We're just going to check if the connection is nothing, then connection is already closed. So we're just going to log that message. Connection already closed, and exit sub. If it reaches this point, then the connection is still open. So, but we want to double check that the state of that connection is open. So we'll go connection state equals AD state open. Again, that basically just evaluates to a 1. And then we're going to just go close and set the connection object to nothing. And we're going to log that we have closed the connection. Log message. And once we've finished there, we're just going to exit the sub to make sure it doesn't jump into the error handler unnecessarily. Okay, so we've got our connection to the database. We can also close our connection to the database. Let's just have a quick test of these two methods. So here in our module, we've got our create database. We've already created that, so we don't necessarily need to create it again. I'm just going to comment that out. So now we're going to open our connection. To that, we're going to pass through our database path and our database password, which are set as constant variables up here. Then we're just going to close that connection again. And then we're going to have a look at the logs and see how that looks. So we're just going to run that. All run fine. No issues. So in here in the VBA logs, this is something else. I'm going to open up that log file. And here we can see, so a little while ago we created the database. Now we've opened the connection to the database. We've connected with this string, and then we've closed the connection. So all seems to be working well. Now we want to actually start building our tables, but we can't build those tables unless we can actually execute a query or an SQL query to the database. So we're going to create a method for executing these queries. These aren't big routines, they're quite a simple routine, so we can just get into those. So we've got a public sub execute query. It's going to be public because although we need to call it from within the database, we also want to be calling queries or executing queries outside the database class, because we're going to need to use these queries all the time for saving information to the database, or updating information, retrieving information, although we might use a bit of a different one for retrieving, but I'll get into that. So we're going to actually pass in the query itself. So you'll notice here when we do our create table, we've just got execute query and we've just got SQL create. So this is our passing our SQL command, which looks like this, into the execute query routine. So in here, we're going to just add in some error handling again. And then we're also just going to add in what the query was. That's going to just help us when we're looking through the logs, if something has happened, then it's just going to make it a bit easier for us to find out what the problem was. All right, and then we're just going to raise the error as well. In here, instead of the error description, because if an error has occurred, then we're going to know that there's a problem with the query. So instead of this, maybe we want to pop up and actually show us what that query is. So I'm just going to change that to SQL query there. Now, all we have to do is to just execute that query. We already have our connection because we've opened the connection somewhere else in our application. That connection object is already instantiated, so we can actually just start using the connection object. So we're just going to execute on the connection object, and we're just going to pass in the SQL query, and we just also pass in this variable execute no records. All right, just keep in mind that there are 2 commas in there. Now, after that, if nothing's gone wrong, then we can assume that the query executed fine, and we're just going to log that query. So that's all we need to essentially execute a query to the database. Then we're going to do something called executing a scalar. Essentially what a scalar does is it executes a query and it returns a single value. We're also going to be doing a method of fetching data. So that's going to be retrieving data in bulk. But say, for example, that you just want to find out what's the customer name for customer with the ID number 5. And we can just execute a query that does essentially that. But just need to create a function here to execute the scalar. So we're going to do public function execute scalar. So the by val query as string, and we want to return that as a variant. We return it as a variant because it could come back from our database as a few different things. It could come back as a null value. Null value just means it is essentially nothing, but it's not necessarily a blank string. It's not necessarily a 0. It is just nothing. If we have this as a string or a number or something like that, then it's going to throw an error when it comes back with a null value. So we're going to just copy our error handler from up here. Also, when we return the value, we just want to maybe just return back a null value. Because this is a function, it always expects something back. If it's not getting anything back, then it could just cause problems and we don't know how to handle that nothing value that it's getting. So we just set that to a null value. So let's finish that off in exit function. Now we're going to need a record set object. So we're going to create an RS, we just called that RS for record set as an object. And we're going to set create object. Again, this is our ADODB class, and we're just going to call that an ADODB record set. Then we're going to do record set open. Then we're going to pass the query, the connection, open static, and read only. Because we're only reading values, we don't actually need to be adjusting anything. So if we just set it to read only, it just makes things a little bit more secure. If not record set end of file, and execute scalar. So this is our returning value. is going to be the first value of our first field. Else we're going to pass back a null value. Now we're going to close that connection and just set the RS back to nothing. I've already put in the exit function there. Okay, so that's our execute scalar. So let's actually create a table now that we've have this execute query thing here. So we're going to be calling this create table method. But how do we actually do that? So in here in our module, first we're going to need to open our connection. Once our connection is opened, then we're going to actually create the table. So we're going to do database object, and we're going to create table. Now, as we're going to be building a bookings manager, I'm going to make a bookings table. So we're going to make one called bookings, and then this is where we create our arrays of fields. So each array is going to be something like booking ID. So this is going to be the name of the field. And then we're going to have auto increment. That's going to be the type of the field. So this auto increment type here is just going to be like 1, 2, 3, 4 as you're creating new records in that table. So then we're going to create another field. We're going to do customer ID. This is just going to be a long type value. Then we're going to have a vehicle ID. Essentially, we're creating a link between a booking, a customer, and a vehicle to create a booking. Next, we're going to create a start date for when the booking starts. That's going to be a date time field. And we're going to do an end date. Again, date time field. All right, so there are all of our, these are going to be all of our fields in the bookings table. But we're referring to these things, a customer ID and a vehicle ID. So we're going to actually need to create these tables as well. It's a good idea to, when you're building tables, to split things up into their own components. Try not to put everything all into one table. It makes it a lot easier to manage when you're creating, say, your customers, your vehicles, and your bookings all in separate tables. Even something like if you're creating invoices, you have invoices, and then each item you assign to an invoice can be on a different table. You say invoices table and invoice line items table. So this just helps you later on when you're managing your data. So here we're going to now create our customers table. So create table, customers. We're going to create that again, array. We're going to have customer ID. Again, that's going to be our auto increment field. Increment. And we're going to log, say, first name. It's going to be a text field, and we're going to set the limit of that text field to 255 characters. And we're going to do the same for the last name. Text 255. Now, keep in mind, I am passing these in as strings, not actual numbers. This is important as that's what's being expected when you're creating these tables from your ADO object. All right, so then we do email. Just the kind of information that we want to get from our customers when we're creating a new customer. Maybe phone number. And they're going to be driving our cars, so we're going to maybe grab their license. So we're going to get their license number. It's going to be a text value. License numbers aren't too long, so we're just going to set that to 50, not 255. And we don't want children necessarily driving our car, so we're going to do date of birth and insert to a date field. Okay, so that's our customers table, and then lastly we're just going to create our vehicle table. So Alright, so we've just created 3 different tables, but obviously they're not in our database yet. Our database still looks completely empty. So we come in here and just run this code. It happened practically instantaneously. And then if we come here to our database, press F5 to refresh, we can see that we now created these 3 tables. So here's our booking ID. You can see here our different variable types. Start and end date here are date and time fields. ID numbers are number fields. Customer ID, all of our information there. Vehicles, all of our information there. So fantastic. Our database has now been created. We can probably start filling it with some information. I'll do that before our next episode, just to fill in some information so that we can start playing with it and doing a few things with it. So thanks very much, and we'll see you in the next one.